So for the third video for evolution, we're going to look at Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. So we'll start by looking at the voyage on the HMS Beagle that took him to the Galapagos Islands. And then we're going to look at some other people who influenced his theory, including Charles Lyell and so Charles Lyell, you see here, and also Thomas Malthus, who you see here, Thomas Malthus. And then lastly, we'll come back and we'll see how he applied all of that into his theory of natural selection. So to start, let's go back up to the start with Darwin and the voyage of the Beagle. And again, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so that I can fit more in. So in 1831, Darwin became a naturalist on a naval voyage. Oops. On the HMS Beagle. Whoa. And a naturalist basically means a field biologist, so somebody who studies biology out in nature, often interested in natural history. And so that is what he kind of became interested in while he was on this journey. And at the time, he accepted the prevailing view that each species was a divine creation, didn't change over time, and was kind of exciting and interesting as it was originally created. So let's write that down. That Darwin accepted the prevailing idea that species were divine creations unchanging over time and interesting as originally created. However, his view changed on his trip on the Beagle. So we'll then go down, we'll take a look at this trip he took on the Beagle. And the key place that it took him to was the Galapagos Islands. And while he was there, he made some key observations. We're going to write those down. So he made many observations in the Galapagos. To start, he noticed that plants and animals were similar, although slightly different from plants and animals native to South America, which if you look over here, here's the Galapagos, and here is South America. And so he noticed that the plants and animals here on the Galapagos were similar to plants and animals from the South American continent, but a little bit different. And so he became convinced, based on these observations, that species change as they adapt to their changing environments, which means that species that maybe started out in South America, if they moved or were somehow brought over to the Galapagos, they had to change in order to adapt to that new environment. So that was Darwin's journey. He started out as a naturalist on this big trip on the Beagle, and it took him to the Galapagos Islands, where he was able to observe that a number of animals in the islands, the Galapagos Islands, were similar to but different from animals in South America. He also noticed, given that this trip took him all around the world, if you were to follow the track, and then he actually came back around this way, back to Europe, he noticed that the animals he saw in various parts of the world were different than those that he had seen in Europe, which also led him to this idea that species change as they adapt to their changing environments. Okay, so then what Darwin did is he was doing a lot of reading and a lot of observing. And one of the people who influenced him was Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, which is worth noting. And again, I'm going to zoom in here so that I can write on these lines, but then I'll zoom back out. So again, Charles Lyell was a geologist. And what Lyell said was he said that physical features of today's Earth, like canyons, mountain ranges, etc., could be explained by natural forces occurring millions of years ago. So the mountains we see today are due to changes that have been going on for millions of years, basically. And so then he thought that maybe similar forces could have created forms of life that exist today over millions of years. So he was applying Lyell's ideas about the physical features of our Earth to the evolution and the development of the living organisms on Earth. So let's write down Lyell's ideas, which again, he proposed that the physical features of today's Earth like canyons, mountains, etc., could be explained by natural forces that occurred over millions of years. So Darwin took that idea and he thought, well, maybe the living organisms on today's planet also could have been shaped by forces over millions of years. Darwin was also influenced by an essay on human population written by Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus was sort of interested in the growth of human population. And what he said was, he said that the human population was growing faster than the rate at which supplies and resources could be produced, which would ultimately lead to suffering and death, as humans weren't able to get all the resources that they need. And then Darwin took that idea and also applied it to all different species. So let's write down again what Malthus thought. Malthus suggested that the human population was growing faster than the rate at which resources and supplies was growing, leading to suffering and death. So again, Darwin took this concept and applied it to all species. So if we look at this second section that we did, Darwin took what he observed on his trip on the Beagle and he combined it with some ideas like those from Charles Lyell about geology and those from Thomas Malthus about population growth. And ultimately, he put all that together in his theory of natural selection, which we'll outline down here. And so Darwin's theory of natural selection is his idea about how evolution happens. And I'm going to zoom in so that I can write a little bit bigger here. And there's 5 different parts to Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. So the first one, Darwin says that organisms vary. So within a population or within a species, not all organisms are the same. Just like not all humans are the same, not all dogs are the same, not all roses are the same. Organisms naturally vary. It's totally natural. Then he said that more organisms are born than will live to reproduce. And so because of that, and because we don't have enough resources for all of the organisms that are born, living things face competition and a constant struggle for existence. And so those two ideas get back to Malthus's ideas about population growth and not having enough resources to support a growing population, a population that's too big for the resources and the supplies that it needs. So there has to be this struggle. And that struggle for existence is a key part of the theory, so we're going to underline it. Okay, so then the next thing that happened is, remember that Darwin said at the beginning that organisms within a population, they vary. And now, because we have more organisms than we can actually support and they're struggling, the organisms with the beneficial variations, the favorable variations, are better able to survive and make it to that age of reproduction than the organisms with unfavorable variations. And this is known as the idea of survival of the fittest, which a lot of people have heard of before. So let's write that down. Organisms with favorable variations can better survive to reproduce. And this is again the idea of survival of the fittest. Let's underline that also because that's a key idea. Okay, so then because they can survive to reproduce, that's the offspring. Those are the organisms that get to reproduce. And those favorable traits are passed on to their offspring. Okay, so there we have it. That's basically how Darwin came to his theory about natural selection. So if we go back up to the top where we started, we started talking about Charles Darwin, the naturalist, and how he took this voyage on the HMS Beagle all around the planet, where he made lots of observations about different species in different places. And he noticed that they tended to be similar to, but slightly different from each other based on their environment. He also did a lot of reading and was influenced by the ideas of others, like Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, and Thomas Malthus, who thought about population growth. And then he took those ideas and his observations and he put them together into the theory of natural selection. And his theory of natural selection says that organisms vary naturally within a population. We have organisms that differ slightly from each other, and that each kind of population or species has more organisms that are born than can actually live to reproduce. So because we don't have enough resources for all those living organisms, they have to compete with each other in what we call a struggle for existence. The organisms with the favorable or better variations are those that will actually survive to the age that they can reproduce. And this idea is called survival of the fittest. And because the organisms with favorable variations get to reproduce, their traits are passed on to their offspring. So there you have it. That's Darwin's very famous theory of natural selection.